Chapter 11, Rival Trends, Tri-Party Building, Round 2. After 1976, no one in the new communist movement retained hopes of uniting the entire movement into a single party, but no group questioned anti-revisionism's basic framework either. Organizations attributed the real and imagined failings of their rivals to opportunist betrayals of Marxism-Leninism, while acknowledging at most mistakes or inexperience as the causes of their own weaknesses. Given the movement's ever-increasing fragmentation and decline in prestige, one might have expected a deeper re-examination, but the core party builders had embraced Marxism-Leninism while participating in intense struggles at a formative moment in their lives. They were still relatively young, mostly between 25 and 35, and the problems they had encountered seemed mere bumps in the road compared to the imprint left by the upheavals of the late 1960s and early 1970s. And there was just enough evidence to make the case that anti-revisionism remained a viable framework instead of a dogmatic construct that just happened to mesh for a brief moment with the worldwide upsurge of the late 1960s. Revolutionary organizations still waged armed struggle in much of the Third World. U.S. capitalism remained beset by severe economic problems, and other sections of the left still displayed major weaknesses. So the main party-building groups held themselves together, and new Marxist-Leninist collectives continued to form. Some lasted only a year or two before affiliating with one of the national organizations or breaking apart. Others, like a particularly sophisticated small circle in northern New Jersey, spent many years building a local base of some size, in this case through the People's Independent Coalition, before fading away. The sheer proliferation of organizations, fundamentally a symptom of weakness, ironically lent the movement a certain energy. A picture of just how maze-like the organizational map had become was drawn in 1977 when the tiny Communist Workers Group published a 17 by 22-inch family tree of the existing anti-revisionist organizations together with each group's genealogy and its relationship with allies and rivals. The diagram, which quickly became known as the chart, listed some 35 organizations, but more striking than even their sheer number was the fact that organizational splits and broken alliances far exceeded the number of mergers, confirming the old saying that one picture is worth 1,000 words. The chart illustrated more vividly than any polemic just how much trouble the movement was in. But most cadre did not see the forest for the trees, and many spent hours poring over the chart in fascination at their movement's convoluted history. Indeed, one of the key facts revealed by this diagram was that as of 1977, not a single group formed on the basis of anti-revisionism had yet publicly challenged any of the essentials of Marxism-Leninism. Neither had any organization simply dissolved because its members could not agree on a direction for party building. To the contrary, most groups seemed more convinced than ever that they were on the correct path. Especially self-confident was the October League, which after RURCP's isolation had attained preeminence within the Maoist camp. On June 4-5, 1977, OL became the third movement organization to declare the founding of a new vanguard. The Communist Party Marxist-Leninist, or CPML, began life with 600 to 800 members and chose Michael Klonsky as chair. A month after the Congress, Klonsky and Vice Chair Eileen Clare headed a delegation to China, where they were toasted by CPC Chairman Huo Gofen at a banquet held in their honor. Top CPC leaders hailed the formation of the CPML as reflecting the aspirations of the proletariat and working people, effectively recognizing the group as the all but official U.S. Maoist party. The combination of steady growth during 1975 to 1977 and then the nod from China, heady stuff for a leadership in their early 30s, infused the CPML with optimism. It undertook an ambitious expansion campaign, with special emphasis on building up the call's circulation. Cadre were mobilized to sell the paper at factory gates and through door-to-door canvassing, resulting in a claim that distribution had reached 25,000 copies per week. Though subscribers as opposed to purchasers of a single copy made up only a small percentage of that figure. The goal of increasing CPML membership by up to 25% in its first year was not met, but the group did gain an impressive 12%. Big changes in Beijing. But beneath these numbers, CPML's ideological foundation was being undermined, largely by accelerating changes in China. In February 1978, the CPC junked all policies associated with the Cultural Revolution and adopted the four modernizations of agriculture, industry, defense, and science and technology as its general strategy for constructing socialism. Later that year, it became evident that Deng Xiaoping had assumed paramount authority. The CPC officially rehabilitated Deng's mentor Liu Shaoqi, allegedly the top capitalist wrote 25 years earlier, and declared that the Cultural Revolution had been a catastrophe responsible for the most severe setback and the heaviest losses suffered by the party, the state and the people since the founding of the People's Republic. Denouncing the Cultural Revolution also meant abandoning the theoretical framework underlying the claim that the USSR had restored capitalism. The CPC ceased referring to the Soviet Union as a capitalist country, or to the CPSU as a revisionist party, and there were numerous signs that the leadership no longer believed, if they ever had, the capitalist restoration thesis. Even so, China's hostility to the USSR and alignment with the US only increased. All official policy statements termed the USSR the more dangerous superpower. In 1977, China backed the intervention of Belgian and Moroccan troops, with French support, in Zaire to save the CIA-backed Mobutu dictatorship from an internal rebellion. China was the main supporter of the Pol Pot regime in Kampuchea, which was committing genocide under the banner of carrying out an even purer cultural revolution than the one Mao had waged in China. With Beijing's enthusiastic support, Pol Pot's armies were conducting a border war against Vietnam, and after Pol Pot was ousted at the end of 1978 by a Vietnamese invasion in support of a dissident faction of Cambodian communists, China invaded Vietnam to teach the Vietnamese a lesson. The US had been informed in advance about Beijing's plans. In the event, China's armies were beaten back in a surprising and humiliating military defeat. Top leader Deng visited Washington in January 1979 and gave an interview to Time stating without qualification that the CPC viewed the US as part of a united front against hegemonism. Deng also encouraged Washington to punish Cuba and more aggressively deal with the trouble in Iran. China opposed the massive popular uprising then underway against the Shah, which culminated in the Iranian Revolution of February 1979. The anti-Shah revolt was conducted by the large Iranian left as well as the religious-based apparatus led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Sharp conflict immediately broke out between these two tendencies, and it took a year of often unarmed battles for Khomeini to consolidate total power. Later in 1979, Vice President Walter Mondale visited Beijing and signed a secret agreement permitting the U.S. to install an electronic listening facility on the Soviet frontier. Defense Secretary Brown followed in 1980 to discuss military cooperation. The CPC also moved to rearrange its relationships within the international left. In 1978, CPC Chair Hua visited Belgrade and declared that Yugoslavia, once the CPC's prime example of capitalist restoration, was a socialist country and that relations with the League of Yugoslav Communists, once the CPC's quintessential example of revisionism, were based on Marxism-Leninism. China cut off all aid to its one-time Albanian ally, and the Albanians responded by issuing a book by party leader Enver Hoxha that declared that Mao Zedong thought was an anti-Marxist construct and that the CPC had been a revisionist party for many years. Simultaneously, what little assistance China had still been giving to other revolutionary movements ceased. In 1979, China closed the Voice of People's Thailand radio station on its soil as part of its diminishing support for Asian Maoist movements. 2 years later, the Voice of the Malaya Revolution met the same fate. Condemnations of Beijing's course began to appear from Western intellectuals who had once been mainstays of support. On May 11, 1977, Charles Bettelheim, the most prominent figure in this group, resigned as chair of the Franco-Chinese Friendship Association, pillaring the Deng leadership for repudiating the Cultural Revolution and even criticizing the theory of the three worlds. Likewise, William Hinton, who had played such a crucial role in popularizing Maoism among U.S. activists, adopted a posture critical of the new CPC leadership, though still endorsing its anti-Soviet foreign policy. Hinton later termed December 1978 the Chinese Thermidor, the moment when the forward march of the revolution was halted and power seized by an anti-revolutionary clique, Washington's counter-offensive. Also eroding the CPML's stability was an increasingly out-of-touch stance on domestic issues. Behind the CPML's turnabout regarding reform unionists like Sadlowski and the United Steelworkers was a more general ultra-left analysis. The CPML declared that U.S. liberalism was a more dangerous enemy than the right wing, that progressive reformers were only spreading illusions and must be the target of the main blow, and that workers were moving rapidly leftward and thousands were ready to join a communist organization. All these assessments were wildly off base. The center of gravity of U.S. politics was moving sharply to the right. Large numbers of white workers were turning rightward with it. and the poorer, more vulnerable and disproportionately people of color sectors had seen both their living standards and political strength eroded by the structural changes underway since 1973. Overall, the rightward shift was driven by an across-the-board counter-offensive stemming from the core of the ruling class, which aimed to reverse the setbacks it had suffered between the late 1960s and mid-1970s. Washington was marshaling its resources to roll back the gains of national liberation struggles, undermine the non-aligned movement, regain a nuclear edge over the USSR, and bolster its competitive economic position vis-a-vis Western Europe and Japan. At home, the goal was to impose a program of social austerity, take back the gains made peoples of color since the 1960s, and weaken the trade union movement. To win popular support, Big Capital turned its ideologues loose to fan racism, raise the alarm about an alleged Soviet drive to conquer the world, and encourage the growth of a grassroots-based extreme right. While full implementation of this program would not begin until Ronald Reagan's presidency, its key elements were put in place under Jimmy Carter, as early as July 1977, when Urban League leader Vernon Jordan harshly criticized the new president for turning his back on African Americans. It was already clear that Carter was moving to restrict rather than expand economic opportunity for communities of color. And in foreign policy, it was Carter who brokered the 1978 Camp David Accords, which decisively broke up the always shaky Arab unity against Zionism. Then the Carter administration, in cooperation with Beijing, which spearheaded the campaign to prevent the Sixth Summit of the Non-Aligned Movement from being held in Havana in 1979, though the gathering was a success and Cuba became chair of the movement for the next 4 years. It was also Carter who backed the Shah of Iran to the very end, and after the Iranian Revolution, approved the Shah's coming to the U.S., despite warnings that this would provoke intense anti-U.S. feeling throughout the Islamic world. Carter's grant of asylum to the Shah led directly to the hostage-taking at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, which in turn became an excuse for whipping up national chauvinism on a scale not seen since the early days of the Vietnam War. Most important of all, it was the Carter administration that started a new round of escalation in the nuclear arms race and laid the groundwork for renewed direct military intervention in the Third World. The first steps were taken in early December 1979 when Washington won NATO's agreement to deploy new ultra-fast U.S. Euro missiles in West Europe, a step that was taken before the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and regarded by many as contributing to the Soviet decision to send in its troops. Then the Soviet action, regarded by most of the world as a foolish miscalculation at best and a gross violation of Afghan sovereignty at worst, provided Washington with the perfect rationale to try to revitalize its Vietnam-damaged policy of deploying the U.S. military against national liberation movements. The president used his 1980 State of the Union address to proclaim the Carter Doctrine, authorizing military intervention to protect Middle East oil or in any situation where Washington felt U.S. interests were threatened. After a decade of détente, during which the U.S. had suffered many defeats in the Third World, a second Cold War had begun in earnest. This new Cold War was not fought by words or nuclear threats alone. Despite the indignation aroused by the assassination of Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Romero by a right-wing death squad on March 24, 1980, just a week later the U.S. approved sending $5 million in military aid to El Salvador to combat a growing popular rebellion. The next month, the U.S. commander in South Korea released Korean troops under his command to participate in the Gwangju massacre, where they slaughtered hundreds of people after protests against the country's dictatorial regime. That same spring, the CIA began organizing former Somocesta National Guardsmen into a Contra army to fight against the Sandinista government, which had come to power in the Nicaraguan Revolution of July 1979. Impacts on the Maoist trend. These shifts in Beijing and Washington shifted the ground underneath the entire pro-China trend. CPML's apparatus was strong enough to postpone its day of reckoning, but the RCP was not so fortunate. Throughout 1976 to 1977, despite its estrangement from others on the left, the organization was able to maintain its work and even expand its ranks. RCP remained energetic enough at the end of 1976 to launch a theoretical journal, The Communist, to replace the long-discontinued Red Paper series, and in 1977 the RCP initiated National United Workers Organization, NUWO, drew 1,500 to its founding conference, but internally RCP was racked by conflict. One set of differences concerned practical campaigns, with a faction led by Leibel Bergman and East Coast activist Mickey Jarvis accusing RCP chair Avakian of promoting ultra-left tactics divorced from the actual level of consciousness of the working class. This dispute overlapped with the main axis of discord: how to assess the changes in post-Mao China. Based both on ideological affinity with Cultural Revolution voluntarism and ties developed during trips to China in the early 1970s, Avakian's sympathies were with the so-called Gang of Four. When they were arrested, Avakian decided that revisionists had taken control in Beijing, but because others in the RCP leadership did not agree, Avakian did not immediately press his views. Instead, he directed RCP publications to express general support for socialism in China but to remain silent about Beijing's new policies. By late 1977, with Mao's arch-rival Deng back in a high post and questions mounting within the RCP membership, this policy was no longer tenable. Avakian then pushed a pro-Gang of Four position forthrightly titled "Revisionists are revisionists and must not be supported. Revolutionaries are revolutionaries and must be supported through a divided Central Committee." Immediately afterwards, he initiated a purge of those who had opposed him on the grounds that they constituted a bourgeois headquarters within the party. His opponents responded by organizing a mutiny, and in January 1978 they led roughly 40% of the membership out of the RCP to form the Revolutionary Workers' Headquarters, RWH. For the first time in 10 years, RURCP was no longer the largest anti-revisionist organization. The post-split RCP was true to its Cultural Revolution principles, if nothing else, and the rest of the left watched in wonder as the group adopted tactics more reminiscent of Weatherman than of the early RU, which had led the way in criticizing Weatherman's adventurous fantasies. The RCP abandoned all efforts at base building among industrial workers in favor of organizing confrontations and symbolic propaganda actions. These reached their zenith in January 1979 during Deng Xiaoping's visit to Washington, D.C. RCP cadre tried to physically confront the Chinese leader, resulting in the arrest of 17 members including Avakian, on felony charges. Avakian went underground and fled the country. He has chaired the RCP from abroad ever since. Though beset by these difficulties, the RCP remained capable of launching new political initiatives. In May 1979 it began publishing a nationwide newspaper, The Revolutionary Worker, and announced the beginning of a one-year campaign aimed at turning out tens of thousands for Revolutionary May Day demonstrations on May 1, 1980. The RCP's dauntless militants poured tremendous energy into this effort, which the leadership claimed would mark a fundamental change in the country's political situation. But on the appointed day, almost no one besides the party faithful took to the streets, turning what was supposed to have been a breakthrough into a stinging sign of the group's isolation. Afterwards, the RCP's core stayed intact and kept publishing a large volume of revolutionary literature, and Clark Kissinger, a skilled organizer who had served as SDS National Secretary in the mid-1960s, assumed a higher profile in representing the RCP, to the group's substantial benefit. Still, reversion to strategies and tactics that had been ultra-left even in the heady late 1960s guaranteed the RCP's political marginalization. For its part, the RWH hailed the winners of the power struggle in Beijing and continued organizing in unions and among students. It denounced the RCP leadership as hopelessly idealist and ultra-left, while carrying over from RCP days the tradition of condemning the CPML, criticizing that organization's leadership as a consolidated opportunist trend. Despite the RW's hostility, however, the CPML was jubilant. For the first time it could claim to be the largest anti-revisionist group, and its leadership recognized that whatever initial attacks came from RWH, their pledge of allegiance to the CPC would inevitably drive them in the CPML's direction. Resistance to CPML hegemony. Even before the RCP split, the CPML had tried to parlay recognition from Beijing into pressure on other groups to join it. A few months after Klonsky was toasted in Beijing, CPML suggested the formation of a committee to unite Marxist-Leninists to coordinate merger talks among all supporters of the theory of the three worlds. A few exploratory discussions were held with Iworkian, the August 29th movement, and other groups, but nothing came of them. Recognition from China was simply not enough to overcome the suspicions that separated the different Maoist organizations. Just as in the early 1970s the Chinese did nothing to press their U.S. followers toward unity, then the CPML did not have sufficient weight on the ground to force other formations to merge into it. In addition, simple force of habit kept the movement fragmented. The Maoist movement had functioned for a decade as a collection of competing groups, with even relatively small differences used to justify separate organizations. Activists, especially organizational leaders, had grown accustomed to this situation. and the path of building larger groups based on mutual compromise simply ran counter to the now entrenched pattern of miniaturized Leninism. IWK was especially resistant to submerging its identity within CPML, though IWK was dutiful in expressing support for the new CPC leadership. Fidelity to Beijing did not play quite the same role in IWK's identity as it did in most other pro-China groups. The IWK core did not define itself above all as representing a particular ideological location within the left. Rather, it saw itself as the true grassroots organizers representing the interests of Asian American communities in the U.S. As such, IWK was not at all inclined to join a CPML, which was pursuing policies sure to alienate IWK's community base, not to mention the fact that it would simultaneously mean submerging IWK in a primarily white organization. Against these considerations, Beijing's recognition of CPML could not prevail. IWK's main energy went in a different direction. In June 1977, it took the lead in forming the Anti-Back Decision Coalition, a BDC, one of the two main coalitions organizing against the California Supreme Court's September 1976 anti-affirmative action decision in Alan Back's reverse discrimination suit, the League of Revolutionary Struggle. Working closely with IWK in the ABDC effort was the August 29th movement. ATM had almost been destroyed by its experiences in the National Constitutions Committee and then the Revolutionary Wing, and was trying to find a more sensible political home. The group, now much smaller than IWK, but retaining a base in Southern California, Colorado, and New Mexico, shared IWK's support for Chinese foreign policy and also its tilt toward nationalism. IWK and ATM forged a close working relationship during the ABDC campaign, which lasted until immediately after the U.S. Supreme Court's final ruling on the Back case in June 1978. The court found for Back, thus accelerating the gathering backlash against affirmative action. At the same time, the court majority did hold that race could be taken into account to some degree in college admissions decisions, a ruling that would be considered favorable to affirmative action in today's political climate. In October 1978, the two groups merged to form the League of Revolutionary Struggle, LRS, combining their two newspapers into a single, much more professional effort entitled Unity, which published bilingual Spanish-English and Chinese-English editions. A year later, the group led by Amiri Baraka, which had changed its name from Congress of African Peoples to the Revolutionary Communist League, RCL, in 1976, joined as well. While avoiding major public polemics with the CPML, LRS kept its distance. It gave top priority to work among students of color and to organizing among lower strata, heavily people of color workers in the garment, restaurant, and similar industries. As of 1979, LRS was still considerably smaller than CPML, but it was made up of roughly 80% activists of color compared to CPML's 25 to 30%. The Communist Workers' Party, Workers' Viewpoint, likewise kept itself out of CPML's orbit while continuing its long-standing mutual hostility to IWK. WVO backed Beijing's foreign policy, but refused to go along with the Deng leadership's repudiation of the Cultural Revolution. Regarding U.S. politics, WVO adopted an even more ultra-left assessment than CPML. Influenced by the depth of the 1974 to 1975 recession and continuing economic stagnation, by 1979 WVO was predicting that the 1980s economic crisis will make the 1930s depression look like a picnic. The group declared that a revolutionary situation was around the corner and said the immediate task was to prepare for the dictatorship of the proletariat. Through 1977 and 1978, WVO focused on professionalizing its cadre corps and sinking roots among low-wage workers, with a concentration of some of the group's most committed organizers in southern textile mills. Having consolidated its infrastructure by 1979, in October the group held its own founding congress and launched the Communist Workers' Party, CWP. Membership stood at 400 to 500, and Jerry Tung was chosen general secretary. Less than a month later, the CWP was catapulted to nationwide prominence. On November 3, 5 members and supporters were murdered by police-assisted Nazis and Ku Klux Klansmen during a CWP-initiated rally against growing Klan activity in Greensboro, North Carolina. James Michael Waller, CWP Central Committee member and president of a textile workers local, Cesar Cos, active in a union organizing drive at Duke University Hospital. William Sampson, organizing at Cone Mills Textiles in Greensboro. Michael Nathan, a physician who quit his job at Duke Medical Center to work at Lincoln Community Medical Center, serving a mostly poor and black constituency. And Sandra Smith, daughter of a Southern textile worker and a founding member of the Youth Organization for Black Unity, thus became the first new communist movement activists to suffer political assassination. Widespread anti-Klan and anti-racist protests were held in the wake of the killings, with participation by a broad range of left, religious, and African-American groups. These actions faced a furious red baiting campaign aimed at taking the focus off the Klan Nazi killers and their connections to the police, and at obscuring the murdered activists' contributions to trade union organizing and the fight against racism. But there were also conflicts among the protesters, especially in relationship to the tactics pursued by the CWP. While most other groups argued for constructing a broad front based on opposition to racist violence, the CWP stressed slogans like "Avenge the CWP5" and argued that support for its own program should be integral to the resistance. Most non-CWP activists criticized this approach and the extremely left strategy behind it. Thus, even though the CWP briefly became the best-known communist group in the country, and many admired its members' courage in resisting armed assassins on November 3 and in challenging the Klan in a city where racist terror was ever present, the CWP was unable to translate these factors into sustained growth. On the legal front, the perpetrators of the Greensboro massacre were eventually acquitted by all-white juries in criminal trials, but the city of Greensboro paid a judgment to surviving Emily members after a civil suit was filed against its police as well as the Klan and Nazis. These monies laid the foundation for the Greensboro Justice Fund, which has now registered 20 years of support for organizations fighting racism and all forms of oppression in the South. The Albanian escape hatch. For some who still regarded the USSR as capitalist but were reluctant to follow Beijing in its turn toward alignment with Washington, Albania's call to oppose both superpowers provided a convenient escape hatch. Thus, two organizations that had stuck with Beijing through the Angola controversy decided that they supported Albania in 1977 to 1978. First was the Marxist-Leninist Organizing Committee, MLOC, one of the factions that had emerged from the Black Workers' Congress. On December 23, 1978, MLOC sponsored still another founding congress and launched the Communist Party USA, ML. Second was the Central Organization of U.S. Marxist-Leninists, COUSML, which had been formed in 1973 mainly by the Cleveland-based American Communist Workers Movement. In January 1980, this group too held a founding congress and declared itself to be the Marxist-Leninist Party. The MLP thus became the sixth anti-revisionist group to declare that it had founded the vanguard of the U.S. working class, but with just 100 members it was the smallest vanguard yet. The shrinking size of newly proclaimed vanguards constituted a definite pattern. The MLP, CPUSML, and CWP gatherings in 1980, 1978, and 1979, respectively, were all smaller than the first wave of founding congresses, CLPs in 1974, RCPs in 1975, and CPMLs in 1977. Pro-China critiques of ultra-leftism, the proliferation of ever smaller vanguards, if nothing else, ought to have alerted Marxist-Leninists to the grip that sectarianism and ultra-leftism held on their movement. But no large group on the pro-China side of the Angola rupture devoted any serious attention to these problems. Two much smaller groups did, however. One was the Bay Area Communist Union, BSEU, formed at the end of 1975 mainly by activists who had left the RU at various times. BSEU disputed the fundamentalist premise that all of RU's errors had been due to its stress on mass organizing before the party had been formed, and while backing the Three Worlds theory, refused to reclassify the Guardian and other pro-MPLA groups as hopeless revisionists. The Proletarian Unity League, PUL, went even further than BSEU in critiquing the movement's problems and dissecting their roots. PUL's analysis was presented in 2-3 many parties of a new type. Against the ultra-left line, which bluntly stated, the rule of capital still enjoys broad if uneven support among the popular classes, the continued disorganization of the communist movement and the collapse of a large section of it into mutually antagonistic parties threatens to frustrate the urgent work of fusing Marxism-Leninism with the workers' movement. The Marxist-Leninist forces count several times the trade union members of all the Trotskyites combined. Only the CPUSA itself has more trade union members and supporters, and in some unions the Marxist-Leninists outnumber even them. But when rebellion breaks out nationally in the Teamster ranks, Trotskyites like the Ites are in an organizational position to do something about it, and the Marxist-Leninists are not. Or when a reform candidacy takes shape in the Steelworkers Union, the CPUSA is in a position to influence it. but the communist forces are basically too divided to have much impact. 2-3 Many parties went on to provide numerous examples of how sectarianism and infantile left tactics had afflicted the movement since its earliest days. Further, the book offered a comprehensive analysis of the roots of these problems in the voluntarist and semi-anarchist ideas prevalent in the late 1960s movements, and in the attraction of those ideas to the students and former students who disproportionately made up the Marxist-Leninist ranks. Puel challenged such disastrous formulas as CPML's no unity of action with revisionism recipe and alone in the pro-China camp. It defended gay and lesbian rights and gay and lesbian participation in communist groups, but neither BSEU nor PUL was able to attract many supporters. In part this was because both groups were too small to widely promote their views. Neither organization could muster sufficient resources to publish a newspaper or journal. Another factor was that both were long on critique and short on providing alternatives, which struck an unresponsive chord among groups that since 1973 had gotten used to looking for quick fixes and resisting self-analysis. Even more important was the fact that any strong critique of ultra-leftism ran up against the main logic and direction of Mao Zedong thought. Mao's idealist slogan, the correctness or incorrectness of the ideological and political line decides everything, was gospel for US Maoists, and it stacked the deck in favor of purism and ultra-leftism. Thus, ironically but not surprisingly, the activists most sympathetic to BSEU's and PUL's critique of ultra-leftism were in the camp that had broken with China in 1976 and were in the process of questioning the whole edifice of Maoism. But BSEU and PUL were cut off from these groups because they refused to link their critique of ultra-leftism to any flaw in the CPC's outlook and were among the most ardent defenders of Beijing's foreign policies. In organizational terms, this left BSEU locked in a limited practice in the Bay Area until it merged in 1979 with a rapidly shrinking Revolutionary Workers' Headquarters. PUL maintained its independent existence as the anti-ultra-left conscience of Maoism, extremely thoughtful but with limited influence, a rival constellation of party builders. Within the wing of movement that had broken with China's foreign policy, organizational development initially lagged far behind. The Guardian was the most widely read Marxist-Leninist newspaper, but it had no cadre beyond its small staff. Other than the CLP, sealed off in largely self-imposed isolation, the rest of the pro-MPLA party builders were either in purely local collectives, mass revolutionary but not Marxist-Leninist, groups such as the Union of Democratic Filipinos, KDP, or unaffiliated. Even if all these activists had been working in harmony, and many of them did not yet even know each other, they would have entered the late 1970s organizational weaker than their pro-China rivals. On the positive side, this emerging tendency was brimming with energy and a desire to explore new theoretical and political terrain, though they were still locked into the communist tradition of unwillingness to openly disagree with Marx or Lenin, but no longer Stalin or Mao, on any major subject. Many had grown tired of the debilitating tendency to try to settle arguments with quotations from the classics. Besides being willing to challenge or at least stretch the boundaries of anti-revisionist orthodoxy, they had an accurate perception that ultra-left posturing and sectarianism were as responsible for the movement's troubles as blind loyalty to Beijing. These groups had generally refrained from the worst ultra-left excesses of the early 1970s and had better ties with the many 1960s veterans who had embraced Third World Marxism but not party building, some of which were developed through common work in support of the MPLA, Puerto Rican independence, the Chilean left, and so on. Finally, they tended to have a more positive attitude toward the women's, lesbian, and gay movements. To a certain degree, the activists who made up this current shared mutual recognition of these pluses, and in 1977 to 1978 many were optimistic that they could be translated into a unified party-building effort. But before such a project could be undertaken, these scattered circles had to establish working relationships with one another. They had previously functioned in the shadow of Maoism. Now they were challenged to center a political trend of their own. The Guardian was in the best position to lend visibility to any new trend, and also to provide a forum for dialogue among its adherents. The paper had played the point role around Angola and was must-reading for almost the entire anti-imperialist left, especially after opening its columns to 4 months of debate over China's foreign policy and sending Erwin Silber on a nationwide speaking tour. The paper had established connections with Marxist-Leninists throughout the country. The nature of any Guardian undertaking, however, was limited by more than its limitations as a newspaper collective rather than a well-rounded organization. Beyond commitment to Third World Marxism, anti-revisionism, and a few specific political positions. The Guardian staff had no party-building strategy. Moreover, many staff members were at least as concerned about preserving the paper's independence as they were with constructing a new vanguard. To the degree that their defense of the paper's autonomy had arisen in response to takeover attempts by the liberated Guardian faction or RU, this sentiment was certainly understandable. It would also have been a viable, perhaps even indispensable, stance for a newspaper advocating broad left unity rather than party building. But it was an outlook that boded ill for the paper's ability to cooperate equally with others in a new organization-building project. These contradictions within the Guardian were not apparent in 1977, however, so the staff was able to agree on an initiative that tapped the paper's strengths, while for the moment circumventing its weaknesses. In a special supplement on building the new Communist Party, the Guardian called for a new beginning for those Marxist-Leninists who had rejected class collaboration, and announced plans for contributing to a new trend's development via a set of Guardian clubs to be led by the newspaper staff. Designed to pursue limited aims, expanding circulation and financial support for the Guardian, pushing forward debate over political line and participating in local political actions, Guardian clubs were launched in 6 cities beginning the following September. The anti-dogmatist, anti-revisionist trend, the Philadelphia Workers' Organizing Committee had less visibility than the Guardian, but it did have the central ingredient that the paper lacked, a thought-through party-building strategy. The PWC argued that the key to forging a vanguard lay in a close connection between party building and mass working class organizing, and that fusing communism with the workers' movement was the essence of the party-building process. The PWC saw dogmatism in theory and ultra-left errors in policy to have been the main problems afflicting previous efforts. In response, the PWC had developed anti-dogmatist positions on the special oppression of African Americans. The black nation no longer existed, blacks were a national minority, trade union work, prioritizing long-term base building within existing unions, an international line. The USSR was socialist, though led by a revisionist party. The PWC's practical organizing was based on these views, and its patient step-by-step approach had yielded results. The group's cadre were active in several of Philadelphia's most important unions and in many cases were central figures in militant rank-and-file caucuses, the most important of which was the Blue Ribbon Caucus in United Auto Workers Local 9E2 at the Bud Company's Red Lion plant. The PWC's newspaper, The Organizer, launched in 1975 and including a small section in Spanish, covered local labor and anti-racist struggles in detail as well as featuring analytical pieces on national and international politics. All this made the PWC a pole of attraction for activists from other cities who were breaking with ultra-leftism. And the PWC had specific advice to give them. It called for forming local collectives, linking these collectives together in an ideological center that would organize debate, publish a theoretical journal, set up a nationwide pre-party group, and finally establishing a full-blown party. Because it had a detailed plan, the PWC was able to launch a more ambitious party-building initiative than the Guardian. In early 1976, PWC took the lead in convening a committee of 5 with the Socialist Union of Baltimore, the Potomac Socialist Organization in Washington, D.C., the Detroit Marxist-Leninist Organization, and Elbaum MIMP, which that June issued the first communication proclaiming the existence of a new political current. A year before the Guardian's party-building supplement, the Committee of 5 argued that differences within the new communist movement had given rise to an anti-revisionist, anti-dogmatist trend. This phrase, which later gave way to anti-revisionist, anti-left opportunist trend or simply the trend, rapidly passed into widespread use, since it identified the two main demarcations defining the new political current: opposition to the CPUSA as reformist, combined with opposition to China's foreign policy and ultra-leftism generally. The Committee of 5 called for meetings among groups that identified with its perspective to lay the groundwork for a joint party-building effort. Progress was slow, however, and it took almost 2 years from the first Committee of 5 statement to unite some 20 local groups in a loose nationwide structure, formed mainly by activists who had participated in the radicalization of the late 1960s, early 1970s. Most of these collectives' practical work resembled PWC's. The Detroit group developed a city-wide organization of health workers and was active in rank-and-file caucuses in the auto industry. In Orange County, California, the Socialist Organizing Committee had once been a New American Movement chapter. it mobilized in defense of a local black community organizer who had been framed by police and attempted workplace organizing in its largely non-unionized region. In Cincinnati, there was a strong concentration in the teachers' union, and in the San Francisco Bay Area, key cadre from Chile solidarity campaigns increasingly turned their attention to trade union work. The Buffalo Workers Movement grew out of that city's Vietnam Veterans Against the War chapter and was heavily involved in local labor and community struggles. In February 1978, these and similar groups met in Detroit and founded the Organizing Committee for an Ideological Center, OCIC, selecting PWOC leader Clay Newland as its chair. Some members believed that the OCIC and the anti-revisionist, anti-left opportunist trend were identical, but The Guardian and several other important organizations in the trend did not join the network. The Guardian expressed a desire to work cooperatively with the OCIC and published its points of unity, but stated that it had differences on party-building strategy, emphasizing unity around political line rather than PWOC's fusion formula. The largest local collective in the trend, the Bay Area Socialist Organizing Committee, BASOC, likewise declined to join, based on its view that the OCIC's points of unity were shallow and did not represent a coherent enough political program to guide a national organization, and that the OCIC's formulas made little provision for the theoretical work or strategic discussions that BASOC felt were necessary. Elbaum MINP did not affiliate either, believing that sufficient groundwork for a nationwide formation had not yet been laid. Still, through 1978 and 1979, the OCIC was the main expression of the new party-building trend. Theoretical review and rectification from other quarters in the same milieu, additional groups made their presence felt. The most boundary-challenging critique of dogmatism was presented by a collective in Tucson, Arizona, which in 1977 launched the journal Theoretical Review, TR. TR promoted the heterodox perspectives associated with Louis Althusser's Nikos Poulantzas, Charles Bettelheim, and Antonio Gramsci. While critical of Chinese foreign policy, the journal continued to praise Mao and the Cultural Revolution, but was influenced as well by Euro-communism. It was also impudent enough to trace the roots of communism's problems to Stalinism. In many respects, TR embodied the same strengths and weaknesses displayed by the anti-Stalinist critics of Marxism-Leninism in 1968 to 1972. It offered a penetrating critique of how anti-revisionism had been turned into a hollow dogma, but was unable to provide much alternative direction or translate its views into any sustained mass organizing. Meanwhile, the group that would later dominate the anti-revisionist, anti-dogmatist trend was just being launched. Beginning in December 1976, a few central leaders of the KDP, Third World Women's Alliance, and the Northern California Alliance, a Bay Area socialist but not Marxist-Leninist group, began meeting to organize a party-building network. For guidance, they drew heavily on the experience that produced the Communist Party of the Philippines, CPP. The CPP had been formed out of a rectification movement in which a new generation of Filipino activists had studied and criticized the mistakes of the country's Moscow-recognized party while immersing themselves in popular movements. Within a few years, they had eclipsed the established CP and attained leadership of a large-scale popular movement. After studying this model, the initiators of the new U.S. network concluded that a careful analysis of U.S. communist history and theoretical efforts generally, rectification of the general line of the U.S. communist movement, lay at the core of party building. Taking another lesson from the Philippine experience, they initially felt that the organizational side of party building needed to be conducted mainly in secret to protect participants from state repression. Thus, their network was initially clandestine and had no formal name, its members and supporters becoming known loosely as rectificationists. The Rectification Network was founded by three individuals, KDP leaders Bruce Oxena and Melinda Parras, and this author, then a leader of the Northern California Alliance. TWW leader Linda Burnham became member number 4, and this core then drew in several dozen others with whom they had worked for several years. Ideologically, the rectification tendency was characterized by a contradictory combination of orthodoxy and innovation. The Philippine Party's influence was heavily Maoist and Stalinist, and the central rectification activists considered themselves the most orthodox defenders of Leninism around. On the other hand, several had been part of the collective that had authored the unorthodox critique of the Black Nation thesis pamphlet, and the group felt no qualms about taking stances at odds even with communist parties they admired, including the Philippine, Vietnamese, and Cuban parties. Several had become strong partisans of Cuban socialism after participating in the early 1970s Vencerium's brigades. They did not share most party builders' insistence that trade unions were by definition the most important arena for mass work and were self-consciously anti-homophobic, with one of their founders, Paras, a more open lesbian than just about any other party-building leader at the time. The rectificationists were as immersed in practical organizing as the PWOC, but believed that the fusion strategy tended to narrow communists' vision to militant trade unionism and fostered anti-theoretical prejudices. They felt more sympathetic to the Guardian's Unite Marxist-Leninist perspective. After dispatching Central Cadre to hold initial discussions with both PWOC and The Guardian, they built close ties with a few key members of The Guardian staff, in particular Erwin Silber and former Third World Women's Alliance leader Frances Beale. These two soon concluded that the Bay Area activists had adopted an outlook similar to their own and turned it into a more developed strategy and apparatus, and were recruited into the rectification network. At their urging, other network members joined the just-being-formed Guardian clubs, and Silber, who had authored most of The Guardian's ideological polemics, began to propound key elements of the rectification perspective. His columns thus became the first place where this strategy was presented to the emerging new trend in the broader left. At the same time, the Rectification Corps expanded its practical work. In April 1977, it took the lead in launching the National Committee to Overturn the Back Decision, NCOBD. In contrast to the ABDC effort launched 2 months later, NCOBD aimed to bring together both reformists and revolutionaries in coalition, and to make its campaign as much a nationwide as a California-based effort. With left-wing but not necessarily Marxist-Leninist African-American activists playing a key role, NCOBD sponsored the largest nationwide demonstration against BAC, which turned out 20,000 people in Washington, D.C. on April 15, 1978. Among party builders, the NCOBD-ABDC rivalry became a key movement battlefront with an alignment almost duplicating the contention over Angola. This time the polemic centered not on foreign policy but on strategies for fighting racism and approaches to coalition building and reform struggles. The Maoist groups leading the ABDC charged NCOBD with reformism for involving non-revolutionary organizations and using the terminology of racism instead of national oppression, while the rectificationists and the leadership of the NCOBD criticized the ABDC for a sectarian and ultra-left policy toward building an anti-racist united front. Within the anti-revisionist, anti-dogmatist trend, the NCOBD campaign cemented ties between base-level activists in KDP, TWW and NCA, while expanding the Rectification Corps' ties nationwide, especially among activists of color, a slowly shifting balance through 1979. The different centers that identified with anti-revisionism and anti-dogmatism both competed for influence and cooperated in various ways to build their common trend. The balance sheet on 3 years of work was mixed. On the plus side, the new trend's initiative relative to the pro-China groups increased. Beijing's collaboration with Washington became ever more embarrassing, and beginning in 1977, Maoism's critics issued a flurry of books undermining the theoretical cornerstone of China's policies, the thesis that capitalism had been restored in the Soviet Union. The first volume, Socialism in the Soviet Union by Jonathan Arthur, was issued by the CLP Publishing House. 2 years later, New Left veteran and OCIC member Al Shamansky published Is the Red Flag Flying? The Political Economy of the Soviet Union Today, and in 1980 The Myth of Capitalism Reborn was issued by a new publishing house set up by the Rectification Project. The authors, Michael Goldfield and Melvin Rothenberg, who did not share the Rectificationists' party-building views, were veterans of the early New Communist movement who had set out to offer theoretical and empirical proof of the Restoration thesis but concluded on the basis of their research that the CPC was incorrect. These books went unanswered, since the CPC leadership was not interested in defending a thesis they no longer believed and their U.S. supporters were ill-equipped to fill the gap. Because there were plenty of good reasons to be suspicious of Soviet policies, Maoist groups were not compelled to alter their political positions, but on the level of Marxist theory they were forced into an embarrassing silence. One result was the first major post-1976 defection from the pro-China trend. In 1980, the CWP published The Socialist Road by Jerry Tung, which announced a political re-evaluation, stated that the Soviet Union was socialist, though led by revisionists, and charged that China's foreign policies had been off base for years. This turnabout by an organization whose leader had once denounced Soviet social imperialism before 20,000 supporters of Puerto Rican independence at Madison Square Garden signaled that ideological momentum had passed to anti-revisionism's younger wing. but translating ideological initiative into actual growth proved difficult. The OCIC grew only slightly in its first year. The Guardian Club effort likewise got off to a slow start, and Theoretical Review and Elbaum MINP were unable to do little more than hold their existing ground. Rectification, expanding its ties within the Guardian Clubs and its practical organizing via NCOBD, was making substantial gains, but as of the beginning of 1979 still had no public voice other than Silber's Guardian columns. Further, while the different centers within the new trend had gradually become more familiar with one another, they had not been able to establish a stable pattern of cooperation. They held different views on everything from the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan to strategies for party building, and though the early exchanges between them were not as crude as the movement polemics of 1972 to 1974, neither were they models of comradely debate. Particularly damaging was the split that took place between the majority of Guardian Club members led by the Rectification Corps and the Guardian staff majority. In late 1978, the staff majority, led by managing editor Jack Smith, proclaimed the Guardian to be in a different political tendency than the OCIC and announced plans to turn the Guardian Clubs into a more ambitious organization. Most club members believed that this strategy exaggerated differences with the PWOC-led groups and was simply an excuse for the Guardian to maintain its independence. A bitter rupture ensued, with the Guardian Club membership, supported by Silber and Beale, breaking away to form the National Network of Marxist-Leninist Clubs, NMLC, in March 1979. The new group published the first comprehensive statement of the rectification framework and had the ability to publicly recruit, thus giving its backers an organizational boost, but its public attacks on the Guardian were extremely harsh, as were its broad-stroke criticisms of the OCIC. This did not augur well for the rectificationists' capacity to establish friendly relations with communists who held differing views. This problem was in part obscured by the fact that the Guardian did in fact use the occasion to abandon the party-building project. Though the paper did not publicly declare a change of direction, it quietly began a transition away from Marxism-Leninism. By the early 1980s, it had adopted a modified version of the left unity perspective it had maintained before its turn to party building in 1971 to 1972. When the Club Guardian split broke open, Silber resigned his post as executive editor while remaining on the staff. He was dismissed after the NMLC was formed. Then he relocated to California, where he was integrated into the Bay Area-based rectification leadership. Because by 1978 the Guardian had less than friendly relationships with every anti-revisionist group, the paper's withdrawal from party building did not cause an immediate stir. Those who had opposed the Guardian around Angola were barely paying attention, and those in the current that the paper had played such a central role in launching were frustrated with what they perceived as the staff's sectarianism. But whether the paper's critics recognized it or not, the Guardian's change of course was a major blow to their goals. For the first time since 1972, the most widely read periodical on the revolutionary left did not advocate party building as the central task before U.S. Marxist-Leninists, in their own corners, CLP, and the Democratic Workers' Party. There were other anti-revisionist groups that refused to follow Beijing, but they did not participate in the Guardian OCIC rectification theoretical review effort to create a new party-building movement. The Communist Labour Party remained focused on its own organizing. A good part of its practice was all but invisible, since it involved fielding skilled organizers who were not publicly identified as CLP members in long-term attempts to gain influential positions in particular unions. Unlike most other groups, CLP did not direct these cadres to fight for the unions to pass resolutions on foreign policy or other issues or to recruit aggressively. Rather, it allowed them great tactical flexibility, believing that the key thing was to get these organizers in positions to provide leadership when a future economic crisis pushed workers leftwards. CLP's main public initiative was setting up the Equal Rights Congress to take up campaigns against the Klan and the late 1970s rise of racist violence, especially in the South. In an entirely different milieu was a group that embodied some of the most contradictory aspects of the party-building experience, the Democratic Workers' Party. DWP was formed by a group of 13 women, all white, in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1974 under the influence of Marlene Dixon, a charismatic intellectual from a working-class background. After her firing from the University of Chicago in 1969, which sparked large-scale student protest, Dixon taught at Canada's McGill University. She worked with the Bay Area group from Canada for a year or so, and after returning to the U.S. in 1975, she quickly established herself as the unassailable leader of the collective. Over the next few years, the group developed into a secret cadre organization to prevent government infiltration and facilitate ideological training among members that functioned publicly through other formations. It set up the Rebel Worker Organization to campaign at workplaces and the League for Proletarian Socialism, targeting the progressive intelligentsia. In many respects, the DWP represented a breath of fresh air. In a male-dominated movement, the group was formed and led by women and expressed a commitment to both feminism and Marxism. Its analytical work on women's oppression was far more sophisticated than the mechanical perspectives that had dominated the per-1973 party-building movement. The organization was critical of both Chinese and Soviet policies, insisted that Marxist-Leninists go outside the bounds of the Maoist-Stalinist canon, and valued the work of Marxists such as Samir Amin, Immanuel Wallerstein, and other advocates of world systems theory. DWP was enthusiastic about Harry Braverman's pioneering 1974 book Labor and Monopoly Capital, which was ignored by most anti-revisionists but remains to this day a pivotal reference point for study of the capitalist labor process and its impact on the working class, and the group's early organizing and propaganda efforts were conducted in a skillful professional manner, but other seemingly paradoxical features coexisted with these strengths. In its internal functioning, DWP was rigid and top-down to a degree unusual even by the hierarchical standards of the new communist movement. Members were subject to nearly 24-hour-a-day discipline, and internal political debate was suppressed by the argument that it was class standpoint rather than political line that determined a cadre's mettle, with the precise definition and practical tests of class standpoint subject to constant change and leadership manipulation. Dissent was harshly dealt with, and purges and expulsions were commonplace. General Secretary Dixon ruled with an iron hand, and almost all major party documents were attributed to her or to other members working under her close personal guidance. In practical campaigns, DWP rejected united front cooperation with other left groups in favor of setting up mass organizations strictly under party control. From the beginning, the group regarded itself as separated by a class divide from all other party-building organizations. The petty bourgeois who makes a career of the left has changed form in order to ride the coattails of history and the backs of the working class. The singular combination of sophisticated non-dogmatic analysis with extreme rigidity and insistence on isolation from other organizations on the left was not due to any difference in capability between the bulk of DWP members and those of other groups. All shared the movement's combination of revolutionary commitment and youthful voluntarism. Rather, its roots lay primarily in three other factors. First, unlike almost every other group, DWP never went through a period of identifying with a broader party-building current and interacting with other sections of it. This freed DWP to explore fresh ideas, but also removed a counter to the "we are the exclusive vanguard" mentality. Second, making class standpoint the prime test for cadre provided an unmatched mechanism to tap members' capacity for self-sacrifice, but especially in the absence of a mass revolutionary workers' movement, it evaded the question of who measures class standpoint and left the door open for extreme leadership abuse. Combined with viewing other leftists as on the other side of the class barricades, it rationalized exceptional measures against dissenters and opponents, such as the DWP leadership's resort to threats of violence, and occasionally its use against rivals and ex-members. Finally, there is historical accident. Marx wrote that history would be of a very mystical nature if accidents played no part in it, including the accident of the character of those who at first stand at the head of the movement. In the DWP's case, the unfortunate accident shaping its development was the character of its leader, Marlene Dixon. Dixon's theoretical gifts contributed to the group's willingness to innovate, and she saw more clearly than the central figures in other groups the limits of official Marxism-Leninism as propounded by the Soviet and Chinese parties. But she was also afflicted with both a deep-rooted dictatorial streak and major substance abuse problems, a combination able to wreak havoc in a highly centralized small organization walling itself off from the rest of the left. The top-down structures of all the party-building groups fostered similar dictatorial qualities in numerous individual leaders, but it was the bad luck of those who belonged to and interacted with the DWP that Dixon had these characteristics earlier and in more abundance. The initial DWP cadre, galvanized in part by Dixon's strengths, did not grasp the impact her weaknesses would have, and as the organization took shape, those weaknesses, and her inner circle's unwillingness to confront them, became embedded in its day-to-day life. The combined impact of all these factors was ultimately disastrous. In the DWP, many of the problems that afflicted and eventually shattered the entire party-building movement stood out in the sharpest relief. Still, during its formative years, the positive sides of the DWP attracted many talented activists. DWP recruited intellectuals from the North American Congress on Latin America, NSCLA, and Health Pac West, but split both research-oriented groups in the process. It also attracted a contingent of grassroots activists, and though the organization remained largely white, it did include a number of skilled organizers of color. DWP threw itself into opposition to the so-called taxpayers' revolt that hit California in 1978. While most of the left missed the boat, California's Jarvis-Gann property tax cutting initiative and similar measures in 18 other states entrenched regressive taxation policies, dried up funds for local and state governments, and have crippled social spending to this day. DWP followed up by establishing a potent electoral apparatus in San Francisco, where between 1978 and 1980 the grassroots ally ANSET setup succeeded in putting 3 tax the corporations initiatives on the ballot and almost passed one of them. The tactic of putting a positive reform on the ballot, something for people to fight for and not just against, had wide appeal, and for a time the DWP-led Grassroots Alliance enjoyed a sizable and multiracial social base, social democracy on the ascent. Meanwhile, in the broader world of national and international politics, the polarization between U.S. Capitol and its opponents intensified, but except on the anti-racist battlefront, where anti-black work and numerous smaller campaigns saw Marxist-Leninists in the forefront, the party builders were nowhere near keeping up with events. To the contrary, the movement's various fight-back efforts were rapidly eclipsed by initiatives undertaken by established labor and liberal figures. In 1978, United Auto Workers President Doug Fraser, denouncing the business community's one-sided class war against working people, set up a progressive alliance of trade union, minority, religious, feminist, and progressive organizations. At about the same time, key figures in the liberal wing of the Democratic Party lobbied Ted Kennedy to challenge incumbent President Carter in the 1980 primaries. While both of these initiatives utilized anti-corporate rhetoric, they were solely top-down efforts that focused on luminaries and organizational leaders rather than grassroots mobilization. Their strategy was limited to getting a liberal to head the Democratic ticket in 1980. In light of the mounting reactionary threat, it certainly behooved all left currents to figure out some constructive way to interact with these efforts. But what was striking about this flurry of liberal energy, which turned out to be very brief, was how it shifted the center of gravity of strategic thinking among socialists strongly to the right. Activists who just a few years earlier had criticized involvement in Democratic Party politics as a violation of principle now immersed themselves in that arena, and in many cases without much concern for how they might maintain a measure of independent radical initiative in the process. Without doubt, a changed mood was evident among the layers of people who had at least loosely identified with radicalism at the end of the 1960s. On the plus side, most had developed a more realistic assessment of U.S. politics and realized that revolutionary transformations were not on the horizon. But a sociological shift pushing many in a more conservative direction was also at work. Many former New Leftists were now entering or well into their 30s and worrying more about career and family issues, a factor particularly strong among those who, unlike the majority of Marxist-Leninists, had gone into professional jobs and were beginning to climb the class ladder. The situation was complex. Certainly a correction of ultra-left estimates of short-term political prospects was all to the good. But a lot more than that was being discarded as many activists grew up. This political drift both fueled and was accelerated by the continuing ascent of social democracy. The efforts of DSOC in these times and individuals in their orbit were bearing fruit. By November 1977, DSOC was strong enough to play the main role in convening a Democratic Agenda conference that mobilized 1,000 people and featured Michael Harrington as the keynote speaker. The gathering yielded an on-paper coalition that paralleled the Fraser-initiated Progressive Alliance, though both, tied to the push for Ted Kennedy in the 1980 presidential contest, had gone out of existence by 1981. DSOC also benefited from the resurgence of the Socialist International under Willy Brandt's presidency, as the former West German leader softened the SI's harsh Cold War anti-Soviet stance and worked to expand its ties in the Third World. For the first time in decades, a left social democratic current was trying to make a dent in U.S. politics and showing some results. The threat from the Republicans combined with Carter's own Reagan-like tilt increased DSOC's appeal to those who had previously been to its right, while greater realism on the part of many ex-New leftists made dissociated politics more appealing to activists who had been on its left. The strongest indication of social democracy's resurgence was the decisive shift of the new American movement and socialist revolution into its camp. In 1978, Socialist Revolution changed its name to Socialist Review and carried the first major trial balloon calling for NMD-SOC merger. NM approved formal merger talks in 1980. From a revolutionary point of view, the revitalization of left social democracy was double-edged. On the one hand, given the large size of the intelligentsia, professional strata, and better-off layer of workers, there was a strong basis for a social democratic trend, and far better that the forces occupying that ground were led by progressive Michael Harrington than hardline Cold Warriors Albert Shanker or Lane Kirkland. At the same time, Harrington-led social democracy was unabashedly reformist and unalterably opposed to revolutionary ideas gaining influence. It made no secret of trying to redirect the energies of activists and grassroots movements into support for trade union officialdom and Democratic Party liberals, and it had a pervasive tendency to downplay or oppose demands that addressed the special oppression of peoples of color on the grounds that they were divisive. A handful of prominent activists of color who were not Leninists but well aware of the central role of the anti-racist struggle waged a thankless battle on this last point, as well as on the need for a more independent stance relative to Democratic Party liberals. Gestures were occasionally made to address their concerns, but neither DSOC nor NM nor any other institution in this trend ever made anti-racist activism a high priority. One result was their nearly all-white membership, with the partial exception of DSOC's capacity to enlist a number of well-known individuals of color to lend their names to the organization's letterhead. Nevertheless, Harrington's fundamental framework, to become the left wing of the possible, appealed immensely to former 60s activists who had been burned by ultra-leftism. This formula's main virtue was its stress on the need to maximize the progressive potential in every immediate political conjuncture, but it was in direct opposition to the proposition that a key task of the left is to expand the boundaries of what is considered possible. In periods of upheaval like the 1960s, it was stubborn allegiance to Harrington's formula that in large part kept social democracy on the sidelines of the most important mass struggles, or even worse, caused its leaders to oppose movements that were breaking long-standing taboos. But in quieter times like the late 1970s, aspiring to become the left wing of the possible appeared to many to be simple common sense. The fact that this position locked its adherents into tailing behind the fluctuations to the right as well as to the left of the liberal establishment was overlooked. Many of these points were made by critics of social democracy at the time, but even when their criticisms were not tinged with ultra-left fantasies of soon-to-come mass upheavals, their impact was diminished by the absence of a strong alternative. The revolutionary and Marxist left remained divided into mutually hostile tendencies from the CPUSA to the Trostekings, and no single one of these had the capacity to challenge the social democratic initiative on its own. In particular, the new communist movement, which in the early 1970s seemed best positioned to become a durable pole of attraction, had squandered its potential via ultra-left policies and damaging splits. Further, its largest groups had hitched their star to a party that had abandoned advocacy of social transformation in favor of alignment with Washington against the USSR, while the circles that had shaken off the albatross of Chinese foreign policy had not yet shown much capacity to unite or project an alternative vision for mass action, and things were about to get worse.